in the charter business over the years. As Baker said, I was first elected to the legislature in 1994, and we passed the legislation. It became part of our 95 initiative passed in 96. I want to ask a quick question from you. How many of you started your charter schools right after that legislation passed? How many do we have that go back that many years? Paul Norcross? Some folks back here. And Joe Ramone, when did you start? 99. I knew it was close because I represented the area in the North Carolina State House and the State Senate for Rutherford County, and was always very proud to be part of watching Thomas Jefferson grow in Rutherford County. And it has become one of our model schools, so thank you, and thank to all of you who were the founding folks. Did I knock something off? No. Maybe. Well, it wasn't my speech, Baker. Those of you that started and you started out in the first out of the gate, you're the ones that have plowed that turf for those of us now that are applying for charter schools. The hat that I wear today is, of course, serving on the Alliance Board, and I do governmental relations. And I can tell you, after serving 17 years in the State House and the State Senate, my proudest time is getting to chair Pinnacle Classical Academy and start a school and become one of you. And you've set some model schools, and don't think we're not watching you, because we are. Our board is looking at what you're doing and what the schools that have been successful in this state are doing, so that we can model your school and have that for our children in Cleveland County as well. You know, when we passed that charter school legislation, some folks called it a bipartisan effort, but that's really not true. That's not the way it worked at all. It was extremely partisan. The House was controlled by Republicans, the Senate was controlled by Democrats. We got the best bill that we could possibly get out of the State House. It was a House bill. And we got the best piece of legislation that we could possibly get out for you to be able to start the schools across the state. I don't think that it's lost on us that many of the administrators of the charter schools across the state, that you've survived at some incredible odds over this 16-year period, because there's been legislation every year to do something to charter schools, to either, some of it improved and some of it would push us back. I'm going to compare charter schools in just a moment to Monopoly game, and that's one more time where you feel like somebody just drew the card that said, take 3 steps back. You must move 6 steps back. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. You know, and that's pretty much how we have felt that in the General Assembly, because we continue to see things bounce back and forth depending on who was in charge in the legislature. You know, basically, running a charter school is a little like Monopoly, because every day is a roll of the dice. You're praying you don't land on someone else's property that has a hotel on it, and we never, never, never get to be the banker. And someday we want to be the banker. We want to be able to receive funds direct and not to have to wait on that money to filter through somebody that thinks it was their money in the first place. So some of those things I think you'll see coming. The landscape has definitely changed. There's a new game board. The Republicans have supermajorities in both chambers of the General Assembly, and we have a Republican governor. This is the roots of where charter schools started. Again, while charter schools have and should not be a partisan issue, it has been the Republicans that have championed the charter schools and choice education. So this is our turn. It's our turn to fulfill the mission of the 95 session law, and it's our turn to make our schools the greatest schools in North Carolina. You know, when I look back at the 95 session law and the mission was to improve student learning, to increase learning opportunities for all students with special emphasis on expanded learning experiences for students who are identified at risk of academic failure or academically gifted. And number 3, it was to encourage the use of different and innovative teaching models. Today, we have the opportunity to work with like-minded people in the legislature, members who believe that education of our children is not a one-size-fits-all business. There are several choice education initiatives that are forthcoming from the General Assembly this year. You're going to see a lot of choice education bills that Representative Stam will be leading in the legislature. And, you have to, again, I'll remind you that on that note, challenge each of you to remember our roots. Remember that 95 legislation, and when it was filed and passed, the charter schools were perceived by many to be the least evil of all the choice opportunities that were being proposed by the House. The traditional public schools fought any competition or any changes to allow choices in education. Today, we need to remember that our schools were created out of that need for families and for children to have a choice that best fits their educational needs. And we need to support those choices too. I've heard a few folks that have, you kind of think, well, you shouldn't be doing vouchers because now you're thinking, that might take a little money out of my pocket. But you know what? That makes us them. And choice education in this state and working for the best thing for children in this state and choices for parents is where charter schools were born. So I hope you'll remember that as those other pieces of legislation filter through the General Assembly. Today in the General Assembly, we have legislation filed, as Baker Mitchell mentioned, to do equity in our funding for our schools. The bills mirror the two Supreme Court rulings that have awarded charter schools and funding the funding that they deserve. The charter initiatives create a charter board of directors that will be appointed based on the knowledge and support of charter schools. And, that may be a little rocky for some of you. I've heard some little noise about whether or not we should have a charter school board. It is constitutional, regardless of what you read in some of the left-wing rags that are on the internet. It is constitutional to create this board, or the legislation wouldn't have been filed. We have one of the best constitutional lawyers in North Carolina and in the country working in the General Assembly for the President Pro Tem, and he helped to write the bill. It is constitutional. So when you set up this board, you'll have people on this board that can help us run our schools. Just exactly what we need is the people that support our schools and have knowledge of our schools, people that have run charter schools, people that understand finance. I would like to be able to know that a board is making decisions about my school that understands finance and understands innovation, understands that each one of us are unique to our communities because we had that ability to be innovative. So that's the board that you'll see appointed. The board will come from the President Pro Tem of the Senate, as well as the Speaker of the House appointments, and the Governor will be making appointments. And it calls for the Superintendent to sit on the board as well as the Lieutenant Governor. Let's talk just one moment about the future and why we need to have a better governance system. In 1996, you had 0 charter schools. We have moved from the 0 to 100 over those first years. In 2012, and when the cap was lifted, 7 schools were added. In 2013, this year, you'll add 24 new schools. That will put us up to 131. 2014, there's approximately 35 applications out there that's floating, still to be determined, but you're looking at 166 schools. If you add 50 schools per year over the next 4 years, it'll bring you to 2018 and approximately 366 charter schools across North Carolina. I don't think it's unreasonable to predict that by 2018 we could see that over 350 schools in operation, and that we'll be serving over 140,000 students, which is about 10% of the North Carolina population of students. And, you know, that's a big challenge, I think, to each and every one of us. The numbers are growing, and the numbers of children and families that we'll be serving, and those of you in the room have to remember the first thing I said, you're the models. Just keep that in mind, because all of us with the new schools, we're looking at you, and we're hoping you'll be that person, you'll be that board, you'll be that school administrator that will help mentor the new schools as they come along, so that the entire charter movement in North Carolina will be a successful movement. With the numbers and the growth, the charters are going to need champions. You are those champions, and you've got to be willing to be the ambassadors to DPI and the ambassadors to the legislature. Baker said something very important, and I'm going to repeat it. You have to get to know your legislator. You need to do the grassroots work. I am lobbying for you in Raleigh, and I am working every day with members and talking about charter schools. But I need that support in your local community. If you do nothing else when you go home, please make sure that you are on Baker's email list when he's sending out those e-blasts, so that the Alliance Board and the pieces that we put together for you, that you can get to know your legislator, use those pieces, and please do the grassroots work at home, because when I walk into their office, I'd like for them to suddenly start telling me about their charter school. And that makes the difference in them passing the legislation and in them trusting me that you're a member of this association and that you have a good relationship with that legislator. This morning I want to say thank you to all of you, because all of you are champions of charter schools, and you've paved that road for the rest of us that'll soon be opening those schools that will number well over 250 plus in the next 5 years. It's you that have dedicated your blood, sweat, and tears, and I know I've seen Joe Mamoni cry. Over the past, yeah, Joe's cried about this, and I'm sure Georgia does too. You know, you've dedicated that time, and we certainly appreciate that fact to you. And the North Carolina Alliance for Charter Schools, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to continue to work for you in the legislature. I'll close now and turn the program back over to one of our long time champions, Baker Mitchell. Thank you.
Debbie has put in an incredible amount of work over on Jones Street to try to wrest the control of charter schools into the hands of those who understand our problems and can, as we said earlier, make a smooth environment for our operations. With that in mind as the state framework within which we operate, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the president of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, Ms. Nina Rees. She spent 20 years in Washington, D.C., beginning with the Heritage Foundation a number of years ago. Then she transitioned into the cabinet with the Department of Education, the Office of Innovation, I believe, which had the charter school department under it. And today is now, we're fortunate to have her as president of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. So with that, please help me welcome Ms. Nina Rees.
Good morning. So thank you so much for that great introduction, Baker. It's nice to be out of Washington for a change. I've been on the job for about 6 months and been busy redoing our strategic plan. And to any of you who have done one of these, you know it's kind of a tedious process. So I'm glad to be out of Washington and where the real action takes place. I was going to talk a little bit about NCAA basketball, and my colleagues told me, you know, if you're not following it, you probably shouldn't talk about this in North Carolina because they take their basketball really seriously, so I won't go there. But I really appreciate the dedication of the North Carolina Alliance and all of you to the cause of charter schools. I used to work, before I came to the Alliance 6 months ago, I worked for about 7 years for a company called Knowledge Universe, which is a for-profit company that ran child care centers. And one of the companies they owned was Kinder Care Learning Centers, so we were very involved in early childhood education. And as you know, your state is at the forefront of this debate right now, since it's at the one of the things that President Obama is a big advocate of. And so, you know, I'm not going to talk too much about early childhood education, but as you know, one of the things that's unique about North Carolina is that public funds only follow low-income kids to high-quality programs. And so when I think about our system and the K-12 system and how public funds follow kids no matter where they go, I'm often reminded of what you're doing here in North Carolina and wonder, wouldn't it be great if we could attach dollars and increase the amount of money that followed low-income kids when they went to really high-quality schools. And that's pretty much what charter schools are about, in my opinion, making sure that our dollars are generating a return on investment and that those dollars are following kids where their parents want to go, which is often a lot better than the schools that they were attending. North Carolina has a lot to be proud of. I'm just going to touch on some national data, which hopefully all of you are already aware of, but you were the only participating state in the country and one of only 8 education systems across the world in which your 4th grade math students outscored the test average and U.S. national average on the 2011 Trends in International Math and Science study. This is back in December of 2012. At the 8th grade level, North Carolina was among only 11 states and countries to score higher than both the TIMSS scale and the national average. So your public school system as a whole has a lot to be proud of. But when it comes to the ability to give children options to attend better schools, when it comes to opening up the door to new charter schools, up until recently, your state has been ranked 23rd out of 43 states on our national model law ranking report. And I'm hopeful that with the changes afoot in the legislature that Debbie touched on, that this will change dramatically in the next few years. We have a lot of work to do. One of the key things that we look to when we decide if a charter school law is a strong law is the amount of money that's following children to that charter school, whether that money includes facilities finance, whether it's the same amount that goes to the traditional public school system. So getting the funding piece right is extremely important, and also making sure that you have independent entities that are authorizing charter schools. But be that as it may, as you know, in 2011, as Debbie mentioned, you lifted the cap on your charter schools, and as I was reading some information about your state, you had about 70 applications for charter schools in this current cycle, which is tremendous. This is the highest number you've had since your law was enacted, and it demonstrates that there are a lot of individuals who are ready, willing, and able to start a charter school if they're given the opportunity, and the cap certainly, lifting the cap certainly helps in that regard. And as, again, Debbie mentioned, Senators Tillman and Dan Suchak introduced legislation for charter schools that creates a new governing board and brings the funding language into alignment with a recent decision by your Supreme Court. So I'm hopeful that this legislation will pass, and that I will come back to North Carolina to announce that you have now reached or increased your score on our model law, and that you're in the top 10, hopefully, in the next couple of years. North Carolina is also home to a great number of charter schools that I am personally familiar with, and I don't know if any of you are in the room. Kip Gaston College Prep, Sugar Creek Charter School, Raleigh Charter High School. Again, I've only been on the job for 6 months. I haven't visited all the charter schools that I should be visiting, but I hope to come back and visit some of your schools the next time I'm in town. And to celebrate, hopefully, the success of the legislation that you have before the legislature. The other data point I just wanted to put out there is that in the 2010-2011 school year, public charter schools in North Carolina outperformed the traditional public school system in math, in science, and in reading in all three of those categories. So when people question whether it was a tough test that you were measuring yourself against and whatnot, the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, is kind of the highest bar you could possibly have. So the fact that the students in your schools were able to outperform their peers in the traditional public school system is a tremendous testament to what you have already done and proof that you are ready to scale and take this success to the next level. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing at the national level since assuming the role of president at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. I started the job when we were celebrating the 20th anniversary of the opening of the first charter school in Minnesota, and a lot of things have happened in our space over the past 20 years. Just to give you a few data points, we have over 6,000 charter schools now operating in 40 states and in Washington, D.C. We are seeing a 7% growth every year in the number of schools that are coming on the market. So over the past 5 years, every year we've seen a 7% growth, which means about 450 new charter schools are opening around the country every year. But at the same time, we did a survey last year and we found that over 600,000 students are on charter school waiting lists. 600,000 students, that's a pretty significant number. These are families who have put their names in, want to go to a charter school, but haven't been able to do so because of capacity constraints. Charter schools are still small. We're only about 5% of the market, but in some communities we're gaining, market share. So in New Orleans, whose name comes up a lot, over 70% of the students attend charter schools. Washington, D.C., where I come from, over 40% of the students are attending charter schools. And when you open the newspaper in Washington, the Washington Post, these days the headlines are, how much is enough? Because we don't have a cap on how many charters we can open. So it's such a silly question to me. It's, so long as there is a demand, you should be able to open these schools, and we should be proud and excited about the fact that there are individuals out there who are interested in starting new schools to meet the demand of the students in the system. Here in North Carolina and Durham, you have over 10% of your students attending charter schools, and again, because of the changes you're making to your legislation and because of the fact that the cap is lifted on your charters in the coming years, I think you're going to see greater concentrations in charter schools. I highlight this because many of us came to this movement not just because we wanted to serve the kids in our schools, but also because we wanted to have an impact on the students in the traditional public school system. So it's not enough to be content because you're serving a few kids well, but ultimately you want to see if your schools are impacting the greater traditional public school system, either by having them come to your school to see what you're doing, or by responding to the pressure of students exiting the traditional system by putting in place certain reforms that will keep parents in those systems. So you should always be looking at who's around you, which schools are operating, and I know all of you are very busy doing your day jobs, working on what you should be working on, but paying attention to the surrounding schools in your neighborhood and whether we can engage them in some constructive way to do better by their kids by modeling what we do definitely should be on our radar. But in places like Washington, D.C., we're already seeing the impact. All of the changes that brought Michelle Reed to the forefront, in my opinion, would not have happened if you didn't have so many families leaving the traditional public school system to attend charter schools. A little bit about polling. Polls show consistently that a lot of people just don't know what a charter school is. I was with a group of stakeholders a few months back. These were charter school stakeholders, and they told me, I bet you if you surveyed the teachers in our schools, they wouldn't even know what the difference is between a charter school and a traditional school. And I don't know if this is true in your case, but we have a lot of work to do to explain, why we're different and why we are the solution to reforming our school system in general. So while general support for charter schools is not high because of the fact that a lot of people don't know what they are, in those places where people are aware of them, the support is very high. And so one of the things that I'm going to focus on at the national level is to raise the awareness and make sure more people understand what charters are, how they work, and why they are the solution. A little bit about politics. As Baker mentioned, I've lived and worked in DC for 20 years, which is something that could make you quite cynical about life in general. I try not to, impact, or I have an 8-year-old daughter, so I try not to let the cynic in me get out as much as it wants to. But one of the great things about charter schools is that it has enjoyed bipartisan support in Washington since it came to the forefront when Bill Clinton was running for president. So Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, all three of them were huge supporters of charter schools. And certainly in the House and the Senate, we have some strong champions of charter schools. In fact, I heard Bill Clinton speak about charter schools at the KIPP Summit this past August, and he was talking about how, when he first started talking about this on the campaign trail, his advisors would tell him, why do you keep talking about this? This is like 1991, there's just one charter school in Minnesota. Not only, no one knows what you're talking about, but even if they did, the opportunity for them to take advantage of this reform is so slim because there's only one in Minnesota. So I wish we had more Bill Clintons out there, because he truly saw the potential of this reform, not just in terms of politics and being able to win his election and so forth, but in terms of the opportunity it presented for us to really reform the way we view public education as something that we're offering to the community, that it's something that the community ought to own, and that it kind of took us back to the roots of what our traditional public school system was supposed to be premised on. Let me touch a little bit also on research. We talk a lot about charter school quality, so the question of whether charters are effective is something that comes up a lot. When I used to run the Office of Innovation and Improvement, I remember I had about 70 grant programs supporting 1,500 projects, and I was new to the job. As a public servant, I felt like I should take every meeting that came to me, because that was my duties, to be responsive. Taxpayers were paying my salary. So at the time, I remember not a single person who came to see me from the grants that I was administering ever came to see me with any research, okay? They would come to me with anecdotes. They would come to me with examples of how the reform impacted the community they were in, how many people they were serving, how satisfied their clients were. But they were not coming to me with a randomized field trial or even anything near the gold standard of research we have supporting charter schools. A lot has changed since then, but what's interesting and great about charter schools is that not only do we have over 200 studies of charter schools demonstrating by and large that they are effective at raising student achievement, but we also have the stories. We also have the human faces. So in terms of your ability to mobilize the grassroots and impact legislation here in North Carolina or in Washington, you have probably one of the best kind of recipes for success. You have both the studies and the faces and the stories, and more than anything for me also, you yourselves, the entrepreneurs who started charter schools, are kind of a great example of what this movement is all about. So I would leverage that. I know you don't like to talk about politics, but I would take advantage of that to grow our movement. Let's see, and if the research is too complex, let me just throw a few more data points. Charters are only 5% of the market, but they comprise 17% of the best high schools list on the U.S. News and World Report Best High Schools list, and 60% of Newsweek's Transforming High Schools list. So these are pretty straightforward numbers that most people who read these magazines should be familiar with. I want you to remember these data points and mention them whenever people talk or question the value of a charter school. So where do we go from here? As I said, I just finished doing my strategic plan, and we decided really that at the national level that we're going to do 3 things really well. And these were things that we've always done over the past 8 years, but our focus is going to be heightened in these 3 areas. So because we're in Washington, advocating for more money to start new charter schools is going to be one of our key areas of focus. There's about $254 million in funding at the federal level to start new charter schools. We need to double that amount. Okay? So that's going to be one of the key things that we're going to focus on. We're also going to make sure there's money set aside to replicate high-quality charter schools. I don't know how many of you are replicating your models or interested in replicating your models, but we should be incentivizing the replication of effective models, giving you the tools that you need, funding definitely being one of them, to replicate something that you're doing if you're doing it well. The next area of focus for us is at the state level, making sure that we have charter schools in all 50 states. We only have about 8 states left to go, and those are pretty tough nuts to crack. States like Alabama, where I was pleased to hear Debbie say that the Republicans are back in charge here. In many of these states that we're in right now, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Republicans are actually not our friend. They're as entrenched in the system as Democrats are perhaps here in North Carolina. So this definitely is one of those issues that crosses party lines in very significant ways. But our hope is that we will make a charter school available to every low-income child in every part of the country over the next 10 years. We're also going to place a huge emphasis on making sure that we're growing charter schools in states that have weak laws and also in places where there is no alliance or organization in place to lobby and to advocate for charter schools. And last but not least, we're going to do a better job on the communications front, telling your stories. I'm really going to rely on Baker and his team to make sure they're sharing with me what you're doing, how you're doing it, so that we're creating an echo chamber that highlights your work and brings attention to the good work that you're doing. On top of that, in terms of our policy agenda, there are 3 areas that I think are crucial in terms of the growth of the charter school sector: quality, innovation, and equity. I don't mean to simplify the problems, but I think if we don't get these 3 pieces right, our movement is going to slow down considerably, and if not, could disappear, in my opinion. If we are not serious about quality, equity, and innovation, we don't have a vibrant movement. So those 3 areas are going to be one of our focal points at the national level. Let me tell you a little bit about quality. So drawing back to my experience at the child care company that we were in, this was a company that was squarely in the consumer space, and there are some rules and regulations around how you can create a child care company, but by and large, their ability to scale was so much easier than your ability to scale, because basically all they did was figure out what's the median income in a particular community so that you can go erect the child care center near someone's home or their work in order for the children to come to that center. Charters, of course, are very different. Depending on the state law that created your charter school law, depending on the regulatory scheme that governs your schools, depending on the authorizer that gave you the school, depending on how well the law is being implemented, depending on how much money comes to your schools, you're going to have a great degree of variability in terms of what charters are in which community across the country. But our opposition treats charter schools as if they were a monolith. So whether you're in Mississippi, which has the worst law, or Minnesota, which has the best law, they treat them as if they're just one brand. And we need to change this perception. So our job, again, at the national level is to get these laws right, making sure that we're creating the climate in which people who want to start a charter school can start a charter school, people who want to scale a charter school can do it in a reasonable way, and to not narrow the discussion simply around let's just shut down the poor performing charter schools. To me, that's important. We need to take that job seriously, but the harder job is to create the climate so that the others can thrive and that newcomers are continuously interested in entering our space. Innovation. when charters were first talked about, a lot of people talked about the subject of doing more R&D in charter schools. But today, when you look at charters, a lot of people contend, there's not much innovation happening in charter schools. I don't believe that. I think it's a question of us going to these schools, doing a better job of discovering the different innovative things that have happened, and to highlight what they are and how they're working. So to some degree, you don't want to innovate too much when it comes to pedagogy when you're dealing with low-income children, right? But there are a whole host of other innovations around how you manage your schools, how you deliver instruction, how you do block scheduling and so forth, that we need to highlight. And again, one of our key jobs at the national level is going to be to make sure that we're reducing the burden of government and the new regulations from landing on your desk. Okay, so this is, again, not going to be one of those sexy jobs that you can go and do one soundbite around. It's going to take a lot of work, but it's important work, and it's work that has accumulated over the years because no one has really been paying attention to how these rules are being drafted, how they're being implemented, and how they're impacting you. There's some rules that, in some cases, quite frankly, it could also be something that your state or locality is doing that's harming you. But by and large, most people blame the federal government, and we're going to take the job of identifying the rules very seriously. And last but not least, equity. I think I'm out of time, right? You told me an hour, Baker, so I planned for an hour, but am I okay on time? So when it comes to equity, as I highlighted to you earlier, we have to make sure that every penny that your children are entitled to follows them to the charter school that they're attending, whether it's federal funding, state funding, local funding. So starting at the federal level, doing a better job of making sure people understand this is the child's dollars and it's in their backpack and it belongs to them, whichever school they go to. So I take this very seriously, not just because I think it will ultimately benefit you as the charter community, but also because I feel that this is, one of those civil rights issues of our time. A child in Durham should not cost more or less than a child, say, in another part of your state. Quite frankly, for me, it's also one of those things that should cut across state lines. So equity is going to be one of the areas we'll focus on. So funding equity, but also making sure that charters are aware of the fact that they are here to serve every child that comes to their doors and that they should not be discriminating against them. We should make tools available to you when you have problems serving the needs of special needs students and English language learners, but ultimately you are in the public space and you have a responsibility to accept and serve all the students who come to your schools. So with that, I wanted to close with a couple of comments. I think, you've already done so much here in North Carolina, and there's a lot of work up ahead. I know that getting you to focus on national issues is probably not the right place to start, but I really hope that you'll continue to work with the students that you currently have. That's probably the greatest contribution we can make as a community. But I also hope that you're going to work collectively to impact legislation here in North Carolina to improve the funding and access to facilities to charter schools. I also ask that you, to the extent possible, that you reach out to your congressional leaders. You have quite a few in Senators Hagan, Senator Burr, Representative Price, Representative Fox, Representative Hudson. Invite them to visit your schools. Invite them to see what your schools are all about. Because ultimately, my job in Washington is a lot easier if they have visited a charter school, if they know a charter school leader, if they know what the impact of a charter school is on the students that you serve. And last but not least, you have these pamphlets on your table. Our national conference is coming up. It's at the end of June, from June 30th until July 3rd. So I encourage you to please join us in Washington, where we're going to talk a lot more about charters and connect you with leaders in other states and share best practices across the board. So with that, thanks again, Baker, for having me. And I'm going to spend the morning with you, so I look forward to meeting some of you.